Good morning, Outward Academy Dagenham. My name is Mr. Thomas, and I'm going to do your assembly today on resilience. But first, a little about who I am. As I said, my name is Mr. Thomas, and I will be joining Outward Academy Dagenham as one of the new assistant principals. I can't wait to meet you and find out what you like, what you don't like, and how we can work together to make Outward Academy Dagenham the best academy in the Outward family and the best academy in South Yorkshire. Currently, I am Head of Humanities at Outward Academy Brumby in Scunthorpe, meaning I teach history, a bit of geography, and life and learning brilliance. So I look forward to, as I say, meeting you all as soon as we can and getting off on the right foot as we go forwards. But today's assembly is all about where can I be more resilient in my life? And this links with our core value of being responsible, because responsible learners are resilient learners, and resilient learners are ones who go on to have the greatest success and ensure that they are leading happy, fulfilled, and successful lives. So we're going to look at some examples of where you can be more resilient in your day-to-day life. So our first thing that we need to look at before we begin is what exactly is resilience? Now, looking it up in the dictionary, resilience is the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties or toughness. So it's all about our ability to face a challenge and to then be able to go forward from that challenge to make sure that we are having a go and seeing what we can put right so that we are successful in the end. We often link the idea of resilience with people who have had tough times, who have kept coming back and back and back, and have been able to eventually have success. And some of the most famous stories about resilience come from celebrities. J.K. Rowling, the author of the Harry Potter books, had many, many versions of her first story rejected by publishers. But she kept going, and eventually she got her book published, and as we know, has gone on to be very, very successful. But that resilience isn't just about achieving great wealth or great publicity or being a celebrity. It's about making sure that actually in everyday life we are resilient and that we face the challenges that every day brings, and we make sure that we are the best versions of ourselves going forward. So what does it mean then to be resilient? Resilient people are people who, when they fail, make sure that they have a look and they reflect on that failure. And they don't beat themselves up about failing, although it might be really tempting to do so. They drive forward and think, well, what was the problem? And how do we go forward from here? How do I, as a person, make changes to move that forward? Now, resilient people face all challenges, and they face it in exactly the same way. They may allow themselves to be upset slightly, but then they take that upset and they channel that into positive energy to move it forward. They don't like the situation they're in, and they do what they can to move that forward and to make sure that they are successful. So part of that being resilient is to have the drive and the commitment in yourself to move forward. But I think also an important part of resilience is the idea of actually recognizing why you fail in the first place, because failure is an important part of life, and we will all fail at some point in our lives. But the idea of resilience is actually, how do we move on from that, and how do we channel what we've learned and move forward? So resilient people are able to move forward and have the courage to continue even when things are tough. So you might think that actually resilient people are people who have got it all together and know what they're doing at all times, and that's simply not true. To have drive and to have passion about something doesn't mean you need to know everything about everything. It means that you are willing to learn at all times. And I think that's the key part that we need to take from this, is that resilient people are always willing to learn and are always willing to put themselves in situations where it is a bit different and they might be out of their comfort zone. Because ultimately, we aren't going to learn any more if we stay in our comfort zone all of the time. And as tempting as that might be, putting yourself out of your comfort zone is what it's all about. So there are plenty of opportunities in school, in our day-to-day life, if we look at our typical journey through school, where we are going to have to be resilient and we are going to have to drive it forward. Now, one such example that often springs to mind will be GCSEs and A-levels. We are all having to do throughout from year 7 to 13 we are going to be doing exams, tests, key indicator pieces, all kinds of assessments. And most people don't like assessments. We don't sit there and go, oh yes, an assessment. How great is that going to be? Often assessments fill us with dread and we don't like going through them. However, they are an important part of that learning process. Assessments allow your teachers to understand where you are finding things difficult, often why you are finding things difficult, and allow them to address those areas of difficulty and help you move forward. Because ultimately, without assessments, we don't know how you're doing, we don't know where you're going, what you need to do next, or how we're going to go on that journey together. But if we only ever succeed in assessments, then actually our learning process is stunted. And we need to make sure that we are learning from where it goes wrong. And students will underperform in tests quite significantly. And we need to make sure we understand how we go forward from that. When I was taking my AS levels, when I was in year 12, I did A-level history. And I'd done very well at GCSE history. And I thought I was quite good at it. When I got my first AS results back from my AS levels at the end of year 12, I discovered that actually, whilst being an A-star student, I'd been reduced down to C's and D's. Now, whilst not a fail, to me it felt like a big failure. But what it spurred me on to do was actually to understand, well, where did it go wrong? And that's something that we need to do when we do fail in assessments or we fail in lessons and we feel like we've underperformed and we've let ourselves down or we've let others down. We need to understand why it went wrong. And that's an important part of that learning process, is dissecting what went wrong and how we move forward from it. So with your assessments at school, when you get that mark back, you should be thinking, what do I need to do now? Where do I go from here? And your teachers around you will be able to help you move that forward. And that's part of what our student response time is all about, helping you to be resilient learners and see that assessment is not a form of judgment, but it is an indicator or a marker of where you are on that journey. And when we start to see assessments as this marker or this indicator, we realise that actually they're milestones in our journey through school and that they are actually helping us, and we can look back at those and think, right, well, that's where I was at this indicator and this is what I've done since, and this is where I go forward from here. So when we look at our assessments, we need to make sure that actually we use it as a learning opportunity. Forget the grade, ultimately, forget the percentage, forget the mark, because most of those ultimately just get us to the next point. But the thing we take from it is what we need to do better. So in your lessons going forward this week, this next half term, all the way through to the summer and into next year, think about, well, what do I now need to do? What do I need to do to make this right? What do I now need to do to move this forward? And when I meet you and I talk to you and we are having those conversations in school around your learning, because that's ultimately what we're here for, then one of the questions I will ask you is, well, what do we now need to do? Where do we go from here? What do we do in order to move this forward? And that can be applied to many, many different situations. We look a bit further at other opportunities, such as behaviour. Now, we don't like to get consequences. We don't like to get detentions. We don't like to rack it up. And we don't like to spend time in the reflections room. But it provides us with an opportunity to be resilient. In lessons, as you can see from my screen, we may have students get C1s or C2s, C3s and C4s. And we shouldn't let the fact that we've got a C1 or a C2 define the rest of that lesson. After all, it is merely a warning. And the one thing we need to remind ourselves of, I think, is that the consequences board is wiped clean at the end of every lesson. And it's wiped clean for a reason. Not only does it allow us to get set up for the next period, but it also shows that we have wiped that slate clean with you. So keep in mind that a C1 and a C2 and a C3 are your warnings that if you continue with that behaviour, then ultimately it will end up in further sanctions. So just because you've got a C1 or just because you've got a C2, it might feel unfair, it might feel unjust, but this is where we need to be resilient. And we think, actually, okay, I have that C1 or I have that C2, but I'm not going to let it go any further than that. So I'm going to make sure that I meet the expectations that my teachers have of me and make sure that I don't get any further on there. As you can see from the image on the screen, Shay made a mistake, got a C1, but ultimately that's as far as it went. And that meant actually at the end of this lesson, I can wipe that board clean and no more said about it. We don't talk about, oh, do you remember that time that the student got a C1? Because I'm sure you don't remember every consequence you've got, and I'm sure your teachers don't remember every consequence they've ever given either. But when we do make those wrong choices and we end up at a C4, it's not, the end of the world. It's not a case of us actually just trying to ignore it and let it go away, because that's not resilient behaviour. Resilient behaviour is to go to that detention, to have that restorative conversation with your teacher about why it's happened, and then move forward from there. It is not about just ignoring it and letting that escalate and escalate and escalate, because the more we do that, the more severe the sanctions become, and the worse ultimately we will feel about it. So if we end up making some poor choices and we feel that this has escaped from us, one thing we can do is make sure that we become that bit more resilient and we take some responsibility for that action. In the same way that we may take responsibility in our assessments at school, we need to make responsibility for our behaviour. And moving forward with that, making sure that we do these sanctions and we clear them, because ultimately that will help you to understand why we're here, what we do, and that we are here to support you. So behaviourally and assessments are two ways that we can look at in school of actually being more resilient. But a further way is actually in lessons themselves. Because there will be times in school where actually we may maybe make excuses for our lessons as to why we don't want to go to them or why we don't like them. And ultimately we need to learn to be more resilient, because in our lives we are going to be in situations whereby we don't like who we work with, we don't like the people we're around, or we don't like the subject of the meeting or the lesson or the conversation that we're having. But how we deal with that is really important. So one of those is that I don't like the teacher. Now, that isn't a barrier to you going into lessons. Now, just because you don't like someone doesn't mean that you shouldn't be in that lesson. We can't go through life all knowing that we are going to like every person we ever come across. And to learn how to deal with people that we don't like in a polite, respectful, and resilient way is really key. Because after all, your teachers are there to do the best job they can to ensure you get the best life chances possible. So just because you don't get on with that member of staff doesn't mean that their advice that they give or the lessons that they teach you are any less valuable. So why would we squander an opportunity to go into these lessons to actually better ourselves just because we perceive that we don't like that member of staff? Or maybe that we perceive that member of staff doesn't like us. But learning how to deal with people that we disagree with or we don't like is a good trait of resilient people. The same goes for the people in the lesson. Everybody is here to learn, and everyone has a right to have that lesson. And we take a responsibility to make sure that we don't disrupt that lesson. But in good lessons, everyone should be paying attention to the member of staff and working in our collaborative groups. And again, it links to the first point, that we don't like a member of staff or we don't like a person doesn't mean we can escape from that period of time. So therefore, we need to make sure that we apply exactly the same ideas as we did when we don't like the member of staff to the people in the room. Because ultimately, if there is an issue between people in the room, your member of staff will deal with the behaviour that comes from that. But if we don't go in because we don't like the people there, we need to be more resilient and make sure that ultimately we go in because that's the best thing for us as people. And that's where we need to go from there. We might think it's because we can't do that subject. And that's a common one that I've heard. I can't do history. I can't do geography. I can't do statistics. So I'm not going in. I refuse to even try. And that is not a resilient learner. You will never get any better at a subject if you continue to refuse to attend. So therefore, it's really important that we go and we learn from those experts that are your teachers, and we make sure that we listen to what they say so that we can go forward. Because ultimately, if we don't attend because we can't do it, we're never going to be able to do that subject. In the same way that if you never learn to ride a bike, you will never be able to learn to ride a bike. So let's make sure we go to these lessons so that actually that barrier is removed, because we become more resilient by trying those things that we find difficult. And yes, it will be tough when you first start, and it will be hard, but it gets easier as you go on. And the longer you're in lessons, the more you're in lessons, the more frequently you engage with that subject, the easier the subject's going to be for you. Same applies that I don't want to do that lesson. We are all going to be in situations whereby we don't want to do things. And that is a fact of life. And if we can learn how to deal with that in school, in the safety net that school has, then this is going to make you very successful as you go forward and more prepared to go into the wider world. Probably my absolute favourite is I'm tired and I can't be bothered. Linked very similar to that, I can't be bothered. I'm tired. But both of those are excuses. And we need to think about, well, if we are tired, how can we put that right? Because the solution is not to simply ignore the lesson or to go somewhere else where we feel like we can maybe put in less effort. It's to think about, well, why is it that I'm tired? Why is it that I can't be bothered to do this? All right, what else am I doing in other parts of my life that are contributing to this tiredness? I think actually, if I make some changes there, I'll have more energy during the day, and therefore actually school will pass much faster and without incident. And that will ultimately make your time here much happier and ultimately much more productive. So there are lots of barriers we put into lessons, but we can get over all of them, and we will have to learn to get over some of them, such as not liking people. We're going to have to deal with people we don't like. If you can't do a subject or you don't want to do that subject, it's not going to get any easier by ignoring it. And actually, going further forward, you need to make sure that you are in those lessons so it does get easier. Because ultimately, you're in a cycle then. If you don't go, you can't do it. And that keeps spinning and spinning and spinning until ultimately we end up at a loss. And I want to leave you on the last sort of bit about success, is that lots of people believe that success happens like the image on the left, where it's a straight line, a linear line from point A to point B, and that we never have any failures. But to fail is to be human, and to learn from failure contributes to our success. So the image on the right shows us actually that success looks like a much more winding path than anything else. And we might start at point A, we will still finish at point B, but we'll have learned a lot along the way. And every one of those times where that line dips back down, goes backwards, curves left, curves right, is an example of when somebody has failed, has learned, removed barriers, and moved forward. To be resilient takes work, and it's work that I know you can all do. Your teachers speak highly of you, and how much they enjoy having you in lessons, and how much they enjoy working with you. So let's make sure in this last week we go forward and we make a conscious effort to be more resilient. And then going forward, it becomes the habit. So that we can say together that students at Outward Academy Dagenham are resilient learners. And we know what that means. Because ultimately, being resilient learners will make you successful learners. I look forward to meeting as many of you as I can over the coming days, weeks and months. And in the corridor, if you do see me, do say hello and introduce yourself. I can't wait to meet you at Outward Academy Dagenham. Thank you very much.